I invite you to turn to Proverbs chapter 1 with me tonight. We are taking a little break from the anchored study and going to look at Proverbs 1, focusing on verse 8 through 19. You know, false advertising is technically illegal in the United States, but that doesn't mean that all advertising paints a true picture of the reality that they're representing. I mean, you've probably, like me, seen ads that give kind of an unrealistic picture of perfection, like those flyers that come in the mail with coupons that have this juicy burger on them. And it's got bright red tomatoes and crisp lettuce and this perfectly grilled, parallel grill lines on this burger, and it's just immaculate. And the reality is that no Burger King anywhere has ever produced such a burger. And yet that's the picture there to entice us. Or, I pay attention to minivan ads on the TV because I have 5 children. And, you see this family with 3 adorable smiling children walking out of their house with a perfectly clean dog following behind them. And it's like an immaculate yard, and they hop into their perfectly clean van. And that's not reality. Like, you don't get that if you buy that particular minivan, but if they put screaming children shaking their sippy cup upside down with a dog slobbering all over, that's not going to result in a lot of car sales. Some ads paint that fake picture of perfection. Some just tell one half of the story. You think of ads for credit cards that show the rewards of the reward points or whatever, but not somebody enslaved by debt, or a beer commercial that shows this lively party, but never the foolishness that happens when someone's drunk, or the catastrophe of driving under the influence. I chuckle every time I see a pharmaceutical ad, which is forced in some way to tell the other side of the story. And so you see this glowing picture of life transformed by some prescription drug, and then at the end, really quickly is this rapid-fire warning that, may include potential side effects like headache, nausea, stroke, increased risk of heart disease, cancer, and so on and so forth. And you're like, oh, that kind of changes the picture, right? All of us are, to some degree, susceptible to advertising. We are influenced by that picture that is painted, but those of us who recognize there's more to the story than what's shown in that little image that shows up in your mailbox, or that's shown in that 30-second spot on TV, are less susceptible to being influenced. But those of us who believe what those advertisements promise are likely to be sucked in. We're going to see tonight that sin and temptation are always guilty of false advertising. They always tell one side of the story. They always promise more than they actually deliver. Hoping you believe that promise and embark on that path. And so tonight, Solomon in the book of Proverbs is going to help us unmask the false advertising, to help us recognize the truth behind the temptation. The book of Proverbs is really a book of practical wisdom. It's a book about how to live the details of life in a way that honors God. It was essentially compiled by Solomon, and much of it written by him, as verse 1 says, the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. This is the wisdom of the wisest man ever to live, other than Christ, written down for us. And it's written, as I mentioned, so that we would have wisdom for the details of life. Verse 2 says, it's to know wisdom and instruction, to discern the sayings of understanding, to receive instruction in wise behavior, righteousness, justice, and equity. It's to give prudence to the naive, to the youth knowledge and discretion. A wise man will hear and increase in learning. A man of understanding will acquire wise counsel. To understand a proverb and a figure, the words of the wise and their riddles. It's to give wisdom that is very practical for our behavior, how we live moment by moment, day by day, in all the different situations of life that we encounter. As verse 6 points out, the book is largely composed of what we think of as a proverb, a short saying that typically some sort of a comparison, almost a riddle that's connecting two things together. As you know, those proverbs are not always promises. You think of some common proverbs like a gentle answer turns away wrath. There are occasionally times where that's not true. It's not a promise, an ironclad guarantee. It's a principle for how life normally works in God's design. They're not really detailed how-to methods. It gives a principle that then is to be fleshed out as we meditate on that and consider our own circumstances. But they are very practical. One author said its function in Scripture is to put godliness into working clothes. Helps us to think about what does it look like to be godly in practical ways as we go throughout life. And these proverbs are educational. They're intended to be taught. The reason Solomon compiled these was so that others would learn of the wisdom that God had given him, and particularly compiled for the sake of his son. If you look at verse 8, he says, "Hear, my son." In chapter 2, verse 1, "My son." Chapter 3, verse 1, "My son." Chapter 4, verse 1, "Hear, O sons." He's writing as a father to his son. It's a reminder of our role as parents, those of us that have children, to be instructing and training our children in the things of the Lord. It's a great blessing to have others do that, but our responsibility is primary, to be teaching them God's wisdom. But we will only gain this wisdom if we understand verse 7, if we have the fear of the Lord. Verse 7 says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction." See, you can't just read Proverbs and say, okay, I'm going to study this and understand this and get it and live it and be wise, unless that starts with and flows from a heart that fears the Lord, a heart of reverence and awe, of humility before God, surrendering and submitting ourselves to Him. One author, Bruce Waltke, said, "What the alphabet is to reading, notes to reading music, and numerals to mathematics, the fear of the Lord is to attaining the revealed knowledge of this book." It's educational, yes, but it's much more than that. It's a response of our heart to the Lord to embrace the truth that He reveals. And in fact, it's interesting that Proverbs speaks of the heart 46 times. It's a book that's very practical, and yet it deals with the internal, with our heart motivations that drive our practice. So if you're here tonight and you fear the Lord and you humbly desire wisdom to live out the details of life in a manner that pleases Him and in a way that is consistent with His design for your life so that your life goes well in accordance with what He has called you to, this book provides that for you. It's a treasure trove of wisdom for us. Now, much of Proverbs is, again, what we expect when we think of Proverbs, which is those short, relatively standalone phrases. That's more towards the end of the book. But the book begins with a series of discourses from a father to his son. Not just short sayings, but longer instruction. And the first of those in chapter 1 really lays a foundation for the book. It establishes two different paths that one can take. You can take the path of folly and sin on the one hand, or you can take the path of wisdom and righteousness on the other. And those themes are woven throughout the book of Proverbs. And as it establishes those two paths, it really contrasts the call to be on those two paths, the enticing call of sinners that we'll see tonight in verses 8 through 19. Sinners calling you to join them on that path of folly and sin. And then the warning call of wisdom, of God's grace, calling out, warning against that path and calling to respond and follow the path of wisdom and righteousness. Tonight we're just going to consider the first of those voices and paths. And as he begins this discourse, he starts in verse 8 simply by reminding of the importance of listening to and heeding instruction. He's alluded to that in the introduction in verses 1 to 7, but verse 8 he says, "Hear, my son, your father's instruction." Now, if you have children, you know that there's a difference between hearing and listening. This is not just be in the same vicinity of where those, the sound waves are hitting you. this is, here in more in the sense of listen to. We see that in second half of verse 8. Do not forsake your mother's teaching. Cling to this. Buy into this. Embrace this teaching. He says if you do that, indeed, verse 9, they are a graceful wreath to your head and ornaments about your neck. He's not talking Christmas decorations there. He's saying when you embrace this wisdom that God has given, that your parents are instructing you, or that Solomon is instructing through this text, it is adorning your life. It makes your life attractive and winsome. It's the way that you ought to live. God is gracious to give that to you, to build these things into your life. Well, verse 10 then gets into the heart of this opening instruction that Solomon is eager for his son to read. Read it with me, verse 10 through verse 19. He says, "My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, 'Come with us, let us lie in wait for blood, let us ambush the innocent without cause. Let us swallow them alive like Sheol, even whole as those who go down to the pit. We will find all kinds of precious wealth. We will fill our houses with spoil. Throw in your lot with us. We shall all have one purse.' He says, 'My son, do not walk in the way with them. Keep your feet from their path, for their feet run to evil and they hasten to shed blood. Indeed, it is useless to spread the baited net in the sight of any bird, but they lie in wait for their own blood. They ambush their own lives. So are the ways of everyone who gains by violence. It takes away the life of its possessors." Now, in the most narrow sense, this passage is a warning to youth against being enticed to join this violent gang of those who are inviting participation in that. It's really fascinating that Solomon begins with this. As we read this, you may have been thinking, I honestly can say that's never happened to me. I've never been walking in my neighborhood and had somebody say, "Hey, come with us. We're going to go hide out behind this fence, and when somebody walks by, we're going to jump them, and we're going to beat them up, and we're going to bury them in the hole. Like we're going to kill them and take all their stuff." Now, maybe you've had that experience. But it's interesting to me that that's the first place Solomon goes in his instruction to his son and the other youth of Israel. Now, if you're a king's son, again, I think that's probably not the first temptation that you would likely face. And yet it's obviously one that Solomon knows is important. But I think there's a larger message that Solomon is giving here in this introductory chapter besides simply that narrow focus, although we'll consider that together. Again, in a larger sense, we can see that not only is he warning against that, but any sort of ill-gotten gain or the temptation to harm others. But in the broadest sense, here at the beginning of the book, I think he's taking his main point, verse 10, "My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent." That's the big point he's making. And then he's giving an example or a case study, an illustration of what that may look like for his child. He's giving them the details of, here's the kind of thing I'm talking about, son. Rather than simply saying, don't do this in principle form, he gives an example that teaches us much about the enticing call to sin when we face temptation. Teaches us that it's false advertising. As I mentioned earlier, it doesn't deliver what it promises and what is so enticing to us. In fact, it delivers the opposite. That's true of the temptation towards violence, towards joining a gang that is pursuing ill-gotten gain through violence. That's true of every sin and temptation that we face. It promises something on the surface, as is the case here, but it delivers something wholly different. If we're going to face those temptations like this and others, and we're going to teach others to do the same, we have to understand that temptation and believe the truth behind that temptation. In many ways, this is how we handle advertisements with our kids. If something comes on the TV and, we haven't muted the commercial or whatever, and one of our kids responds, "Oh, Mom, we have to have whatever." Think how good life would be if only we were eating whatever that commercial is for or had whatever that product is. What do? Do we say, "Man, you're right, let's go buy it"? No, not usually anyway. We usually say, "No, guess what? That's not entirely a true picture." Even if we got that, it won't radically alter our life in the way that commercial pictures. We try to unmask that for them to help them recognize what is really true so that advertisement doesn't have that pull on them. In the same way, that's how we need to battle temptation, and we need to instruct our kids to battle temptation and others as Solomon did here. We must see the truth behind the temptation, which starts in verse 10 and 11 with understanding the enticement to sin. He begins by helping his son understand the enticement to sin, really verse 10 through 14. What is it? What does it mean to be enticed by sinners? Back in verse 10, he says, "My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent." To entice really means to provoke to do something, and it conveys the idea of deception or persuasion. In fact, it's related to a word we saw briefly back in verse 4, that word to give prudence to the naive. The word naive is connected to this word entice. Because the naive are what? They're those who are particularly gullible, those who are easily deceived into believing something or living in a particular way. That's what he is warning about. Don't be deceived into responding and being provoked to do something. You see this word elsewhere used in just a general sense in verses like Judges 14:15, when Samson, you remember, had given a riddle and they couldn't figure out what the riddle was. And so it says they came to Samson's wife and said, "Entice your husband so that he will tell us the riddle, or we will burn you and your father's house with fire." They said, "Hey, you got to do this for us. Entice your husband." You couldn't just go to him and say, "Hey, these other guys want to know the answer to the riddle. Will you tell me?" She couldn't be up front. They said, entice him. Figure out a way to manipulate and deceive him to get him to tell you this. Jeremiah, when he was having a rough day in Jeremiah 20, verse 7, he said this, "O Lord, you have deceived me, and I was deceived about becoming a prophet." I didn't know what I was signing up for. God hadn't really deceived him, but that was how he used that word, to deceive. So this passage speaks of the enticement or the deception of temptation. Because again, just like advertisements today, sin rarely presents itself as it really is. And so Solomon warns his son, if you are enticed, if you are drawn in through the deception of others towards sin, do not consent. But again, Solomon doesn't just give that principle. He could have stopped there in verse 10. Said, "You got it?" "Yeah, I got it." "Okay, let's go on." But he doesn't. He instead begins to do a little role play with his son, which I think is a great model for us as parents for how to help our kids to think and respond and understand. How many times do you say something to your kids like, "Don't be mean to your sister," and then they walk off and like 3 minutes later, they're doing exactly what you had in mind when you said, "Don't be mean to your sister," and they look at you like, "What? What am I doing?" But if you say, "Hey, when I say don't be mean to your sister, here's the kind of situations we're talking about. When they take your toy, don't yell at them and hit them and grab it back. That's what I mean." That role play is helpful to flesh it out. And again, that's what Solomon is doing here. He role plays to help us understand when we may be enticed and how we are to be enticed. And he starts by helping us see that we can be enticed by the peer pressure to sin. By peer pressure to sin. Because notice what's going on. He says, "My son, if sinners," plural, "entice you." Multiple sinners. Sometimes the enticement to sin comes when there are a myriad of others or multitude of others who are calling you to join them in sin. You see that in these next 3 verses. He says, "If they say, 'Come with us.'" And what do they say? "Let us, all of us together, do this. Let us ambush. Let us swallow them alive." We together will find all kinds of wealth. We will fill our houses with spoil. Throw your lot in with us. We'll have just one purse together. We'll be this great group of camaraderie together. What is this playing at? What is this a distortion of? Why do we feel the weight of other people calling us to do something and we're drawn to it in a way we never would have been had we not been in that group or not been with that crowd? This is a distortion of God's good desire that we have for fellowship and relationship. We are made to exist in community and in relationships with others, and yet sin distorts that and uses that. Satan tempts us through that to pursue fellowship not with the righteous, not with other believers, but to be a part of whatever group it is that we are around. There are certainly times when sin loves isolation, but there are also times when it loves company. When we are drawn to sin, not because of simply what's going on in ourselves, but because of those around us. It can come from other physical people around us, maybe even as you think about the holidays and you're going to be with extended family and how they're going to be responding to one another and how they're going to be thinking and the kinds of things they're going to pursue, especially if they're unbelievers. And it's so hard in that context to stand firm for what you believe and to respond rightly in that way. Maybe it's with classmates at school in various contexts or co-workers. This peer pressure, this pressure of the group, of the masses can come not only from real people, but from the media. So much of what we watch on TV or are exposed to in those ways is communicating, this is how everyone's thinking. If you think differently than this, you're crazy and out to lunch. And this is the pressure that we have to conform. This is what is normal and expected of you. Solomon says, son, the naive, the gullible, run headlong into sin with the masses. They are deceived and enticed by that. They are enticed by the sin the group is calling them towards. Do not do that. Understand that you can be enticed by the peer pressure to sin. When we face those situations, understanding that draw and that temptation is the first step for us to battle that and to deal with that. But not only do we need to understand we can be enticed in that way, but we can also, secondly, be enticed by the false promises of sin. What is this group of peers, this mass of sinners who are going to entice this son? What are they calling him to? Well, notice again, verse 11, they say, come with us, let us lie in wait for blood, let us ambush the innocent without cause. This couldn't be more clear that this is not self-defense. This is not a biblically sanctioned means of violence. This is wickedness. This is waiting for one who is innocent to ambush them without cause. He says in verse 12, we will swallow them alive like Sheol, like the grave. We will consume them, even whole as those who go down to the pit. We will leave nothing left. Now, why would this appeal? What is this promising this young son to be enticed by this? Well, certainly it's promising acceptance or respect within a group related to the peer pressure we've already talked about. There's this promise of you can be with us, you can be one of us. For us, again, it's probably not, hey, come with us, we're going to go murder somebody, but it's if you laugh with us at something that's inappropriate, or if you complain with us about someone, or maybe lie a little bit with us, then you can be one of us. Sin promises acceptance or respect within a larger group. Often it sometimes simply promises excitement or pleasure and adrenaline rush. That's what's going on here. You can almost picture that when it's saying lie in wait and ambush the innocent. You can picture this group of sinners who are waiting eagerly to ambush one without cause. The heart is racing. This is the draw, and in some cases of violence, of theft, of sexual sin that is promised. It's more than that here. They go on and say, we're going to do this. Verse 13, why? We will find all kinds of precious wealth. Seems as though they're going to ambush this innocent one and then take their possessions, possibly what they have with them, or possibly, to kill or hurt them and then go into their home and take their wealth. He says, if you do this with us, you'll get all kinds of precious wealth. We'll fill our houses with spoil. Verse 14, we'll have one big purse that we can all share in. We'll be wealthy together. We're doing this for the money and all that comes with it. One commentator said, sinners love money and use people to get it. That's the picture here. Saints, on the other hand, love people and use money to help them. But here this enticement comes with all these empty promises. If you do this with us, if you join us in this, you'll be accepted in our group. It'll be a rush. It'll be fun. We'll have a great time doing it together, and we'll have wealth at the end of the day. That's sin. Promises that on the surface we can be enticed by, but promises that it either cannot deliver at all or that it overvalues, that it says you got to have this. Taking something good and making it essential. Solomon warns his son. He says, this is what they're going to say. This is what they're going to draw you in with. They're going to entice you with the promises of what sin will give you, with the camaraderie of joining in this group. Lest we say, oh man, I'm just such a victim then. It's the circumstances I'm in. It's the sinners drawing me in. It's the false promises I wasn't smart enough to see through. I was helpless in that way. We do need to recognize that Scripture teaches that we are enticed not only by peer pressure to sin and the false promises to sin, but we're really enticed by our own desires for sin. Solomon doesn't highlight this as much in this text, although I think it's clearly implied because he knows his son would be drawn to this. But if you turn over to James chapter 1, James makes this point very clearly. James chapter 1, beginning in verse 13, he's describing temptation that we face. And he says in verse 13, let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself does not tempt anyone. God is not the author of evil. But, verse 14, each one is tempted when he's carried away and enticed by what? By his own lust. It may be in the context of a group of people who are trying to draw you into sin. It may be in the context of sin that is promising something that you're having a hard time seeing the truth of, but the root issue is our own lust. What's lust there? It's not simply sexual lust, as we think of it, but it's any desire. It's our own desires. What happens when we're tempted, when we're drawn in, we're enticed by our own desire for something? When, verse 15, when lust has conceived, it gives birth to sin. It starts off as that desire, and then it births sin. And when sin is accomplished, it brings forth death. That's why James goes on in verse 16. He's not switching to a new topic, but he says, do not be deceived, my beloved brethren. Every good thing given and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shifting shadow. You see, why do these false promises of sin appeal to us? Because of our desires, because we desire those things. We desire something that God has either clearly forbidden or that God has withheld from us at this time. Sometimes it's not a desire for something that is in and of itself wrong, but it's that God hasn't given it to us now. Which is why verse 17 reminds us you battle temptation by reminding yourself that God has given me every good thing and every perfect gift. If I don't have something, I don't need to go figure out how to get it in a sinful way. I need to trust that God's withheld this from me for now. I don't need this. I can be content. If we're going to resist temptation and stay on the path of wisdom and righteousness, we must understand the enticement to sin. We got to recognize it's false advertisement. We don't get that flyer in the mail and run out and buy the burger. We know it's not going to deliver what it's promised. But we also have to, secondly, recognize the reality of sin. Back in Proverbs 1, Solomon goes from telling his son and us, here's what they're going to say to you. Here's the situation you're going to be in. Here's the example of what will come, to now he gives commentary on that. He gives the reality of what is really going on. Verse 15, he says, my son, do not walk in the way with them. Keep your feet from their path. We'll come back to that in just a second. But why are they not to do that? Why are we not to do that? Verse 16, for their feet run to evil, and they hasten to shed blood. Indeed, he says, it is useless to spread the baited net in the sight of any bird, but they lie in wait for their own blood. They ambush their own lives. He says the reality here is not the picture that they're painting. They say if you join us in this sinful violence, you'll get camaraderie, you'll get excitement, you'll get wealth. It'll be great. Join us. He says, no, what's really happening, verse 16, is they are running headlong to evil. Sin is not this attractive thing that gives all this good that it claims. It is evil. It is wickedness. See, the truth behind this temptation is it's not join us for a good time together that will lead to wealth. It's we are running headlong for evil. Proverbs 6:16 and following says, there are 6 things which the Lord hates, yes, 7 which are an abomination to him: haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that devises wicked plans, and feet that run rapidly to evil. See, Solomon reminds us and his son that this act or attitude may be accepted or encouraged by your group of peers. You may be the only person standing there who isn't excited about this. And yet the truth is, it's an abomination to God. It may be culturally accepted. It may be accepted in that break room at work. It may be accepted around that table at Thanksgiving, but it is an abomination to God. You know, we may be tempted to think, oh, there's some benefit or good that's going to come from this. God says, no. You don't pursue things that way. You trust me, and when you don't do it, it's abhorrent to him. We may be drawn to it. We may desire it. We may find it attractive, but God hates it, Solomon says. It is evil and wickedness. See, we must care more for what God thinks than what our peers think. We must desire God more than anything else. Sin is evil, even though it masquerades as an attractive thing to us. And sin, secondly, he says, is foolish. Look at verse 17. He says, indeed, it is useless to spread the baited net in the sight of any bird. Say, what? What's he talking about here? He goes from violence and evil, and now he's talking about catching birds. And so he says, it is useless or vain to spread the net in the sight of any bird, any winged animal. There's some debate over the translation of this proverb, and a lot has been written on that. Some say that the bird can see the trap, and so the only way to catch the bird is to set the trap when the bird is not watching. So it's vain to spread the net when the bird is watching. You've got to spread the net when the bird isn't watching, so that way you can catch the bird. If you think birds are smart, that's how you might be prone to interpret this, because you can't spread the trap while the bird is watching. But it could also legitimately be translated, in the eyes of the bird, the net is spread for no reason, which would imply that it doesn't matter when you spread the net. When the bird sees that, what's it looking at? The food. It's saying, hey, I don't care that there's a net. I don't know why there's a net. All I see is the food, and that's what I'm going for. Maybe some birds are smart enough to recognize, some aren't. We don't really need to decide that, because either way, the point is, when you are setting a trap for a bird, what matters is that they either do not know or do not recognize the fact that it's a trap. All they see is the food. All they see is the grain that has been laid out for them. What's his point? He's saying that is how the naive, that is how the sinners are viewing the sin. All they see is the food. All they see is what they think they're going to get out of this, and they totally miss the reality that this is a trap that's going to destroy them. You know, birds getting trapped in a net because of the food, is that worth it? Can that bird say, well, man, I'd sure do that again because I want that food and I'm willing to do that. You know, it's a high cost, but it's worth it. No, it's not worth it. It's not worth it for that animal. It's not worth it when we pursue sin. It's foolishness. That's why the book of Proverbs repeatedly contrasts wisdom and folly. Folly is not a good thing. It's foolish. It doesn't make any sense. It's not worth pursuing. So it is with sin. We go for what we think will benefit us in the short term with no thought of the consequences, and unfortunately we can be prone to do it time and time again. Like that proverb in chapter 26:11, like a dog that returns to its vomit is a fool who repeats his folly. It doesn't make sense. Ought not do it, because if you're thinking clearly, it has no benefit long term. He says sin is evil, son. No matter what it presents itself, it is evil and it is foolish. It's not worth it. And sin, lastly, he says, brings destruction. Look at verse 18. He builds off what he was saying the sinners would say in verses 11 and 12, where he said they lie in wait and ambush the innocent. Now he says the reality is, verse 18, but they lie in wait for what? For their own blood. And they ambush not the innocent, but they ambush their own lives. He says they think they're ambushing others, but the reality is they are destroying their own lives. This is like Proverbs 5:21 and following. It says, for the ways of a man are before the eyes of the Lord, and he watches all his paths. His own iniquities will capture the wicked, and he will be held with the cords of his sin. They think we're free, we're doing what we enjoy, we're reaping the benefits of this, we're destroying others to get what we want, but the reality is they are destroying themselves. He really makes that clear in verse 19 when he says, so are the ways of everyone who gains by violence. It takes away the life of its possessors. As Proverbs 10:2 says, ill-gotten gains do not profit. You can get a little bit of extra money, but it costs you your life. You know, you may be here tonight and you may read a passage like this and you may say, man, that was me, or that used to be me pursuing ill-gotten gain and violence. Maybe you look at your life and you say, man, I am so drawn to sin. The reality is we all deserve the loss of our life and the destruction of our life for our sin. You know, you may not have lied in wait and killed somebody, but how many of you guys have been angry before? You know, Jesus said, if we have been angry, we are guilty of murder. Not legally in our culture, but before God we are. And so before we pat ourselves on the back and say, well, man, at least I've never done that, we need to be honest with ourselves and say, before God, I've done that. You know, if we didn't have the rest of God's revelation and we recognize those things, we would be overcome with despair. But as we have sung about tonight, the reality is that we do have hope. Even though sin is evil and foolishness, and yet we've pursued it to our own destruction, the reality is that Jesus was the only one who never gave in, who never was enticed. There is hope for us because of Him. And yet sin still reaps horrible consequences when we pursue it, even as believers in this life. And so if we are going to battle temptation, not only do we have to be motivated by the gospel, but recognizing, understanding the enticement to sin and recognizing the reality of sin, that it is a road that leads to destruction. But this is not simply an intellectual exercise. Solomon doesn't just want his son to be able to pass a test on what these people are saying and how that contrasts with what is really true. He wants him, thirdly, to respond to the temptation to sin. What did he tell him in verse 10? He said, "Do not consent." Don't give in. What do you say in verse 15? "My son, do not walk in the way with them. Keep your feet from their path." There's a progression there. Do not consent in that one-time opportunity when you are tempted to sin. Don't give in then. He says, son, don't walk in the way with them. Don't have a pattern of life that is characterized by those things. Don't do it once and don't have that as your pattern. And in fact, don't even walk near them. Keep your feet from their path. Be as far from that. Now, that doesn't mean you can never interact. You can choose always never to interact with people who are enticing you to sin. If it's coworkers, you can't say, well, I'm out of here. If it's your family, you can't say, well, we're never coming to Thanksgiving because you guys entice me to complain a lot, or you entice me towards other things. We can't always entirely run, but in terms of our own growth and sanctification, we can not consent to that. We can have a different pattern of life. We can keep our feet from that path. That's what God calls us to. No matter the temptation, whether that's a temptation towards gang violence or temptations towards something as simple and respectable as complaining around the holiday table, we must understand the enticement to sin and recognize the reality of sin and respond to the temptation to sin. Now, as I mentioned, this is not simply about violence, although it is, but it's a case study in that larger principle. And we see elsewhere in Scripture that this is the pattern that temptation takes for us. You see this if you go back to Genesis 3, the first temptation in the garden. What was going on? Satan, an outside influence, was enticing Eve towards sin. And how did he entice her? Did he tell her the truth? You say, have I got a deal for you? You eat this, spiritual death for the entire race. It'll be great. No. He said, have I got a deal for you? God, he's not been telling you the truth. This is what's really going on. So if you eat this, you eat from this fruit, God knows your eyes will be opened. You'll be like God, knowing good and evil. It's a false promise. It wasn't true. And yet Eve believed that lie when she saw the tree was good for food and a delight to eyes. It was desirable to make one wise. She took it and she ate. Those desires, she was enticed by that desire in her heart. She believed that lie. She gave in to that sin, and the result was destruction. Solomon gives other case studies in the book of Proverbs. Chapter 5 and chapter 7 deal with sexual sin and temptation, and same thing. Chapter 5 describes the external pressure and false promises of the adulteress. Verse 3, the lips of an adulteress drip honey, and smoother than oil is her speech. Seems great. But reality, what's the truth? Verse 4, but in the end she is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Chapter 7 describes the same thing of a harlot who is calling out, who is promising delight, enticing him, verse 21 says, with her flattering lips and seducing him. And suddenly he follows her as an ox to the slaughter. Verse 23, until an arrow pierces through his liver, so he does not know it will cost him his life. Yes, that's temptation to sin. It's believing lies that Satan would love for us to believe, that this promises great reward and blessing. Don't believe the truth that God forbids this, that God hates this, that God says there's a better way to trusting Him. Don't believe that. Run this way. As we wrap up our time together tonight, I want you to think about common temptations you're likely to face this week. Probably the best way to do that is to think about the common temptations you faced this past week. Maybe not going to be enticed to join a violent gang. I hope not. I hope you won't be out walking through your neighborhood and somebody will try to entice you to this. But you will be in a situation where you hear the enticing call to sin. Perhaps that's the temptation to go along with the crowd in another way. Perhaps it's to laugh at something crude or complain about a boss or joke harshly with a coworker or family member. You may be tempted towards greed or ill-gotten gain to think, if only I could have a little bit more, I'd be happy and content, and so I'm going to fudge my hours or not work as hard when I'm on the clock, or some underhanded practice, or taking something that belongs to another. Maybe it's that temptation towards sexual sin of Proverbs 5 and 7, where you believe the lie, where you are enticed by what God has forbidden in your mind or on some electronic device. Maybe it's simply temptation towards anger or impatience. When you've been parenting your kids and they're not responding, and Satan wants you to believe, if you just yell at them, that'll get their attention. They don't deserve patience, and that's what you should do. Or with a spouse, maybe if I show them how I feel, maybe they'll treat me differently in the way that I think I deserve, or on the road towards other drivers, or any number of other temptations you face. What does that sin promise you? When you're in those temptations, what is sin lying to you? How is that false advertising? How is that minivan family where everything is perfect, wanting you to think, if you just get this van, your life too could be like this? Is it some excitement or pleasure, some temporal wealth, some sense of camaraderie, some other desire that you are longing for? We need to recognize the truth behind the temptation. As appealing and attractive as that may seem, it is evil and foolish. God hates it, no matter what the crowd says. It leads not to gain, but to destruction. We are to flee from it. And when we fail, we are to take joy in knowing that Christ never did. When we are enticed by sin, He never was, and He took the penalty that we deserve. You may be here tonight and say, man, I've never not given in to sin. No, I've not done as far as I could, but I've been mastered by sin. I don't even desire to fight against it. If that's you tonight, you're not going to accept the wisdom of Solomon until you come to fear the Lord, to respect Him, to humble yourself before Him, to run to His Son, and then to desire this wisdom that we would walk in a manner that pleases Him, worthy of Him. May God give us that grace this week, not to consent when sinners entice, but to walk on the path of wisdom and righteousness. Let's pray together. Thank you, Lord, for this book. Thank you for the wisdom that you have revealed in it, wisdom that affects our day-to-day life, the details of life. We long to live in very practical ways, in a way that is honoring to you, in a way that is in accordance with how you have designed us to live. And yet, Lord, we recognize that all around us is the call to sin, that our culture and many of our peers and even our own hearts lead us to be enticed by what you have forbidden, or lead us to be discontent with what you have withheld. And Lord, I pray that you would give us the grace this week to see the truth behind the temptation. Help us not to believe the lie, to not believe that sin will be the solution to what we need and desire, but to trust you, to recognize that every good and perfect gift is from you, that you have withheld nothing that we need for this life. Lord, help us to trust you this week. Help us to honor you this week. Help us to be a pleasing testimony in the midst of a world that is longing to entice us to sin. Use that for your glory in Christ's name.